So when you read in this prophecy 3 times about Christ's control of speech, it has something to say for us. Of course, there is another reason. In certain situations, Christ did not defend himself verbally because he represented us and we're guilty. That's another reason. Right. Verse 8, by oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. Now, this is a chapter of paradoxes. He's a root out of dry ground, but he's going to be very fruitful. He's going to have a very large family of millions, but he's a root out of dry ground. He's despised and rejected of men, but ultimately he'll be exalted. God will chastise him, bruise him, pierce him, but God will elevate him. He's cut off out of the land of the living, but he prolongs his days. He dies without a child, and after his death, he has millions of children. He experiences terrible suffering, and then we're told of his prosperity. It is full of paradoxes, and only in the history of our Lord Jesus do we find the paradoxes are resolved. When it says he was cut off from the land of the living, and it goes on to say he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, with the thieves on the cross, but in a rich man's tomb. And yet, if you look at, please, at verse 10, the last half, he'll see his offspring and prolong his days. So here's a magnificent prediction that this sufferer who would be cut off would prolong his days, that this sufferer who would not have a child of his own would see his offspring, and they'd be like the stars of heaven. He's assigned a grave with the wicked, with the rich in his death, though he'd done no violence. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. That is a hard verse. You know, the Bible speaks of the wrath of God 587 times in the Old Testament, using various Hebrew words, about 20 different words. 587 times. There is more said in the Bible about the holiness of God than about the love of God, because the holiness of God is a great circle which includes all God's other attributes, including his love. But one of those attributes is that God is opposed unalterably, inimically opposed to sin. He's opposed to evil, and this is called wrath. Not like our bad temper, not like the wrath of heathen gods. It just means the inevitable reaction of holiness against evil. That's what the wrath of God is. The inevitable reaction of holiness against evil. Now the cross, we said earlier, it magnified the law. It satisfied justice. It nullified sin. It petrified the devil. It glorified God. And it justified all humanity. But take the first two. Magnified the law and satisfied justice. God in the beginning had a law, and he said, if you break this law, you'll die. Now, if he did not fulfill the promise, his government would go into tatters. God had to show he was against sin. The cross does that. God had to show he's for sinners. The cross does that. God has to show he is just. The cross does that. God has to show he's merciful. The cross does that. It's all in the cross. Don't leave any of it out. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, note that it says Christ's life becomes a sacrifice, a guilt offering, what the Hebrews called an asham, a trespass offering. If a man stole from a neighbour and his conscience rebuked him, he had to go and return more than he stole and make an offering. This was called a compensation for sin and guilt, a compensation for a spiritual debt. Well, the whole world is in debt, and Christ has made a guilt offering for the whole world, for your sin and mine. After the suffering of his soul, you'll see the light of life. Through the night to the light. Ardua ad astra, through darkness to the stars. That's somewhat of a pattern of life. What we have in every 24 hours. Darkness, dawn, light, darkness, dawn, light. That's somewhat a pattern of life. We've got to hang on when it's dark because the morning will come. If you're tempted to suicide, you should say to yourself, I can live one day. And when that day's up, you should say, I could live one day. Anyone who lives one day at a time need not yield to the temptation to suicide. But it's perfectly normal to have the temptation. And almost every normal person by the age of 40 has wished they could suicide. Through darkness to light, through darkness to the stars.